All right, guys. Today, to get your notes ready, this is just going to be a single page that I want you to make your page look like this. So it might be helpful if you take a sheet of paper and turn it sideways like this, and then copy this grid in it. On one side, it needs to say advantages and disadvantages, and on the top side, it needs to say north and south. Don't worry, the A's you don't have to write. Yeah. You don't have to write this stuff at all right there, but you do need to write north, south, advantages and disadvantages. You don't need to write the question marks, but I want you to be able to list advantages the north had in this box here, advantages the south had in this box here, and so on. I am just going to discuss what some advantages the north and the south had going into this war, and what I would like you to do is write down the ones that you think are important. Now, all of them are going to be in yellow, but I'm going to let you pick and choose which ones you think are most relevant, and I would say at least write a couple of things in each box. Of course, at any point, if you need to slow down or whatever, you can pause the video, and that's perfectly fine. This is Civil War advantages and disadvantages. Now, if we're going to compare the two here, remember it's the blue versus the gray. I mentioned that in the last set of notes, so you'll see this a lot. The north is blue, the south is gray, and both of them have different advantages and disadvantages, but there is one side that has the overwhelming advantages. If you look at the total population, 71% of Americans live in the north. Only 29% live in the south at this time. Bank deposits, 81% of the bank accounts and money was in the north, in northern banks, only 19% was in the south. 86% of the factories in America were in the north, only 14% were in the south. The north had 0.1% of cotton production, plantations. The south had 99.9% of that. So there's an advantage the south had. Now, these are not things you're going to be writing in your boxes yet. Just wait for that. I just want you to check this out, okay? The majority of the food crops are made actually in the north. The majority of the horses are in the north. The majority of the donkeys and the mules are in the south, but that's not as helpful because they tend to be a lot more stubborn animals. 72% of all the railroad tracks in America at the time is in the north. So you can see just from the chart here, the north has some definite advantages. But they also have some other ones. Here's some that you can write down inside the box that you created. They have a much larger population than the south. They have more factories. They have more resources. They have more manufacturing. They can create weapons much faster than the south can. I believe it's like for every 32 rifles that are made in the north, one is made in the south. It's ridiculous numbers like that. There are more banks in the north, more ships. They can actually make sailing ships up there. The south has a hard time producing like that. They have a very good leader, Abraham Lincoln. He's actually a very good tactician. He's a brilliant leader. They have more railroads. They have more weapons. These are some of the advantages that the north has. Now, in between every time that we talk about advantages and disadvantages, I'll show you something as well. In the north, check this out. Every single line you see here is a railroad track system that was created. Now, above this line is the north, below this line in the middle, this arrow is the south. Look at the difference between the railroad network in the north versus the network in the south. To make matters worse, do you notice how the networks in the north are mostly the same color? That means they're the same gauge track. The same train can run on it. But if you look at the north, there are so many different colors, green, black, orange. What that means is every time you switch to a different track, you have to switch to a different train as well to continue on your journey. You can't use the same train. So not only is there 3 times the amount of track in the north, but you can start from someplace in the north and get to where you're going most of the time without having to switch trains. That's not true in the south, and it makes transportation difficult, especially if you're transporting military supplies and personnel. Now, the north does have some disadvantages through all of this. At the beginning of the Civil War, the generals that they have are unskilled. They are lousy generals. Most of the best generals in the U.S. Army before the Civil War are in the South. All the best military colleges are in Virginia at the time, which means when the South leaves the United States, all of those generals join their home country, their home states, and Lincoln is left with nothing but inept, stupid generals, and they are very ineffective. This helps explain why the South wins the first half of the war and the North is losing despite their advantages. Another problem is the North has the disadvantage of they have to invade the South to force them back into the Union. They want the South to stay. The South just wants to be left alone. The North can't allow that, so they have to invade, which means they're going to be fighting on unfamiliar territory, not on home turf. It's kind of like whenever OSU or U of O plays Boise State. That blue field of theirs is a huge disadvantage for teams that are not used to practicing on it, which is why the Oregon Ducks, when they are getting prepared to play Boise State, they paint their practice field temporarily blue just so they can get a sense for what that territory is going to be like to play on. Well, the North had no such way of doing that, and so fighting on unfamiliar territory is a huge disadvantage. And another disadvantage they had is to win this war, they have to defeat the South. They have to actually make them lose. The South, on the other hand, they can just draw out this war for as long as they want. As long as they don't suffer a complete and utter defeat, they can keep going, which means this war is going to cost the North a lot. Now, as far as resources are concerned, there's also some major differences here. You can see how many workers there are for how many workers are in the South. Over 1 million workers in the North, not even 100, well, just barely 100,000 in the South. You can see that for every 2.5 factories in the North, the South has half a factory. That means for every 5 factories in the North, the South has 1. That's a bad disadvantage. The North has $1.5 billion worth of goods, like products that they make every single year. The South makes $155 million. Barely, what? Not even 10%. Well, almost exactly 10%. The North has 70% of the railroad track. The South only has 30%. Clothing, the ratio is 17-1. For every 17 pieces of clothes in the North, there's 1 in the South. For firearms, for every 32 rifles made in the North, 1 is made in the South. Pig iron, which is what you make cannons and cannonballs out of, for every 20 cannons you can make in the North, you can make 1 in the South. There is some major differences between the North and the South and what they're capable of creating in the middle of wartime. Of course, the South does actually have some advantages, and if you think about it, it's really the opposite of the North's advantages. The North's disadvantages, excuse me. The South is fighting a defensive war. They're on defense. They can hide behind walls and up on hills and things like that, and the North has to actually come to them. They know the land. They've got home turf advantage. They know where all the shortcuts are. They know where all the defensible positions are. The North doesn't even have maps of the territory that they're going to be invading. There is no Google Earth during that time period. There is no satellite reconnaissance. They only know what they have on a piece of paper, and if they don't have a piece of paper, they don't know. That is a huge advantage for the South. The South had amazing generals. We're going to be talking about these guys. Robert E. Lee, James Longstreet, Stonewall Jackson. Incredible generals who were effective at taking a force that was almost always outnumbered 2 or 3 to 1 and getting victory after victory after victory. They had amazing generals. The people in the South had a strong support for this war. Most people were on board with it. At first, that wasn't the case in the North. People in the North weren't all supporting going to war. Many of them were anti-slavery, but they weren't sure that going to war over slavery was the right way of doing things. Got to remember, racism still exists in the North during this time, quite a bit. I would argue is almost as much as it does in the South, but it's a different form of racism. Their racism is, hey, people living in the South are not worth going to war over. Many people in the North felt that way, but the majority did support the war. But in the South, it's an overwhelming majority wanting to support the war, and they just had to keep the North from winning. Just stretch this war out as long as they can, kind of like America during the American Revolution. The South comes up with the same plan. Draw this out, make the North get so tired of fighting war that eventually they go back home like Britain did. The only difference is there's no ocean separating them. And that makes a big difference here. When you are neighbors and you are going to war, that is way different than going to war with a country that is 3,000 miles away. As far as the military strengths here, the North, you can see the Union forces, which is in blue, in 1862, the second year of the war, versus how many people are in the South. The South wins almost every major battle that year. So those numbers are amazing. They are outnumbered more than 2-1. They are outnumbered more than 3-1 in 1863, and the South manages to win a good majority of the battles that year. And then you can see at no point is the military from either side even. The North is always outnumbering the South 2-1, 3-1, and at times as extreme as 4-1 by the very end of the war. So you'd think from this it would be completely hopeless for the Confederates, but it's amazing how close the South actually came to winning this war. But we'll talk about those things later as we talk about the battle. Of course, the South does have disadvantages, and this is the last thing to write in your notes today. They have a much smaller population. They have very few factories, few resources compared to the North. They have less railroads, fewer weapons. They really are outgunned and outnumbered in every way and sense. If you take the North's advantages, that automatically becomes the South's disadvantages. And those are the major advantages and disadvantages between the North and the South. Now, looking at this, here's a question for you. Knowing all the advantages and disadvantages, if you knew nothing else about the Civil War, didn't know about the outcomes or what the battles were going to be like, who would you say, based off of the numbers, would win the war? And how long do you think the war would actually last? If I was answering that question, I would probably say the North is going to win this in weeks. They're going to win this outright, no problem. They're going to completely stomp the South, and this is going to be over maybe in a couple of months max. And both sides felt that exact same thing going into the war. The North thought, hey, we're going to win this easily in a couple of months because of the numbers you're seeing right now. The South believes the same thing, though. They believe they're going to win in just a couple of months. But they believe it not because of the numbers, but because of their fighting spirit and the generals that they have. They believe in why they're doing it. And they are, let's be very clear on this. Most people in the South are not fighting because they are pro-slavery. Remember, only 25% of people living in the South own slaves. Southerners are fighting against what they see as Northern aggression. In other words, Northerners pushing for things on the South, like not allowing slavery to continue to expand. So yes, slavery is part of this. But if you were to ask a typical Southern soldier at the time, and they did this during the war, they went up to them and asked them, especially when they were captured, why are you fighting this to protect slavery? Most Southerners were like, no, I'm not fighting this to protect slavery. I'm fighting this to protect my way of life, to protect my ability to make decisions in my state without states from the North telling me what to do or forcing me to make decisions that me and my neighbors don't want to make. Now, this is kind of a hard thing for us to understand. I was born in California. I was raised in Oregon. Both of those states were in the Union at the time. I have never been raised in a southern state. I don't know that mentality as well. But for a lot of people, it's hard to understand that there is a disconnect between people in the North and the South and the reasons why they fight this war. But even more importantly, a Southern person is not necessarily fighting this war just to preserve slavery, but also for more than that, which is why there is a raging debate today about what was the Civil War really about. Does it include slavery? Absolutely. Was that the main cause for it? Yes, arguably. Although there's all other things that are part of that as well, and that brings up an argument about state rights. Do the states have a right to be able to make choices and not have the federal government always tell them what to do? That's a part of this too, and something we'll look at in the next several weeks as we finally start the battles and the major events that happened during the U.S. Civil War. Thank you very much.